I'd like to now move on to these neuroscientifically investigated constituents of well-being and say a little bit about what I mean by them. And these were presented in the 2015 World Happiness Report. This is a report that is done under the auspices of the United Nations. And this was the third World Happiness Report. And this is authored by 3 economists. And for the very first time, they asked a neuroscientist, yours truly, to author one of the chapters. So it's hard to read, but this chapter that we authored is on the neuroscience of happiness or well-being. And in that chapter, we talk about 4 constituents of well-being that have been neuroscientifically investigated. And very briefly, they are resilience, and we define resilience here as the reactivity to and the recovery from adversity. Individuals who recover more quickly and perhaps show less reactivity to adversity are thought to be to have higher levels of well-being. Positive outlook is in many ways the flip side of resilience, and it has to do with the capacity to savor positive emotion, to have the positive emotion endure. And so if there's some positive emotional experience that one has, the question can be asked, how long does the afterglow, if you will, from that experience last? And I should say that each of these has been intensively investigated in terms of underlying neural bases. And I'll say more about that as we go along. But with positive outlook, we've learned a lot about this from studies of depression, actually, where depressed individuals fail to show sustained activation in the ventral striatum, and the duration of activation in the ventral striatum in several studies that we and others have done has been shown to relate to certain aspects of well-being. The third quality or constituent of well-being is attention, and this goes back to the video that Josie and I did that you saw at the beginning, and to paraphrase the subtitle of a recent major paper on attention that actually came out in Science a few years ago from a group of social psychologists at Harvard. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind. And so the capacity to focus attention may be importantly associated with well-being, and I'll say more about that in a few moments. And finally, the last constituent that I'd like to note is generosity. There is now a growing neuroscientific literature that suggests that acts of generosity promote well-being, and they also activate this circuitry in the brain that has been associated with well-being. So I'm going to talk about each of these 4 in one way or another and ask the question how different forms of meditation practice may impact these particular constituents of well-being and their underlying neural bases. Okay, so first, resilience, the reactivity to and the rapidity of recovery following negative events. And so we've asked the question whether individual differences in this process are associated with certain kinds of negative affective traits, and also whether interventions designed to decrease negative affect, promote positive affect, such as certain kinds of meditation, may affect this process. So let me begin by illustrating 2 hypothetical individuals. If you imagine at time point 3 some adverse event occurring, you can plot your favorite dependent measure on the ordinate here. It could be activation in a specific brain circuit, or it could be a peripheral biological signal, or for that matter, it could be a behavioral measure. And if you look at this individual and compare it to this individual, what I illustrate is that these 2 individuals are showing comparable reactivity in this case, but person B is recovering more quickly. And so the question is this meaningful variance, and are these processes ones that may be impacted by different forms of meditation? So we have used a simple, what we call an implicit emotion regulation paradigm, a picture that's either negative or neutral is presented, and after some period of time it's followed by a neutral face. And one of the questions that we're asking in this kind of experiment, which, and I'm only going to go into certain features here for lack of time, but we're asking the question whether the emotion from the emotional picture spills over, if you will, and impacts the processing of a neutral face. And so we can interrogate these different time periods and begin to obtain answers to these questions. So this is showing data from a group of non-meditators. These are normal individuals. This is a sample of 129 participants, simply showing activation, robust activation in the dorsal amygdala in response to negative compared to neutral pictures. And if you look down here, we split the data into those who score highly on a self-report measure of neuroticism or anxiety, very highly correlated, and compare those to a group that scores low. The high neurotics are in red, the low in the green color, and you can see that in the latter part of the time course they show a divergence, with the highly neurotic subject showing a slower recovery in this period, showing more amygdala signal in this period. And so these data suggest, and this works, by the way, if you look at this continuously across the entire distribution. And what these data suggest is that there's important variance that's carried in this portion of the curve.